Well, commercial capital of Côte d'Ivoire, Abidjan, plays host to the 2025 Africa CEO Forum for the next 2 days. The forum will convene over 2,000 CEOs, investors, heads of states and ministers to discuss the pressing economic issues facing the African continent. For more on this, let's cross to Abidjan now, where we're being joined by Arise Business Correspondent Rotus Oddiri. Good morning, Rotus. Thanks for joining us. Surely there's a lot of activity at your end.
Indeed, Abby, a good day to you, good day to all our viewers out there. A lot going on. Yes,
yeah,
indeed.
Certainly. Well, let's begin with the economic backdrop for Africa as the 2025 CEO Forum kicks off. What can you share with us about this?
Well, the backdrop is one of uncertainty, right? I mean, where do we begin? Oil prices, right? You're in the 60s. You have a lot of commodity-dependent African nations that depend on these commodities for revenues. So you've got lower commodity prices. Then you've also got the trade tensions, although I know the US and China have, thawed things a little bit. But you've got trade tensions, you've got lower commodity prices, you've got higher inflation, you've got a lot of challenges that the African continent is facing. So there's also economic nationalism, where you have more countries striking bilateral deals and becoming more protectionist. And so, Africa is facing a situation where it has to pull itself up by its own bootstraps. And that's what the CEO Forum is going to be looking at with the heads of states and the CEOs and everyone else that you've mentioned that's going to be here.
Right, quite a myriad of factors playing a role there. But let's look at the theme of this year's CEO Forum, and how does this tie into today's global economic reality?
Yeah, so the theme is Africa in a transactional world. Everyone's talking about the Qatari royal family and that big Boeing 747 that they're giving to President Trump, although they're saying they're giving it to the Pentagon, but then it goes to his presidential library later on and so on and so forth. And pretty much, that's transactional, but the theme, of course, is the bilateral deal. So what the CEO Forum is saying is that there needs to be a handshake between the various governments on the African continent and their respective private sectors. So the handshake between South Africa, Ramaphosa is here, that's the president of South Africa, the handshake between the South African government and the South African private sector, the handshake between the Nigerian government and the Nigerian private sector, Rwanda, pick your country. So the theme, of course, is, look, I think there's even a sub-theme where it says Africa needs a new deal, and you've got, two hands that are shaking each other. So essentially, in the world, there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of volatility. You see gold prices and how they've been rising, the yen strengthening against the US dollar. Capital is flowing into safe areas because they're just not sure about things right now. And the opportunity cost of that capital going into gold, going into the yen or the Swiss franc or elsewhere, is that it doesn't go into African nations for the deals, the rail, the infrastructure that we need to build here. So how do we do that on our own? That is why they're saying that it is the private sector that is going to be the foundation for that handshake and the development for Africa going forward.
Right. This handshake is certainly quite symbolic of quite a myriad of multiplier effects. But what are the key pillars that this handshake between the African governments and the private sector will be based on primarily?
Yeah, so they're looking at 3 pillars. Number 1 is accountability. We talk about that in Nigeria all the time. Okay, you've got lower oil prices. What happens if you're an individual where your salary is cut by 50%? Well, what's the first thing you're going to do? Well, you're either going to look at borrowing, but before you even borrow, you're going to have to cut your spending to, align your quotes with your size. And so accountability for governments on the African continent is about watching their spending. No jeeps and SUVs for convoys and so on and so forth, more focused on welfare and the like. So the private sector wants to see accountability on government. You're telling us to tighten our belts, you're charging us, more taxes and so on and so forth. What about you? Accountability is pillar 1. Pillar number 2 is policies that are directly focused on industrialization. That's one of the panel's discussion. I have a panel I'm moderating tomorrow on industrialization. Electricity, what kind of, so if you take an example of Nigeria's Electricity Act, where the new administration wants to decentralize electricity access and electricity policies to the states. So policies, pillar number 2 is about policies that focus on industrialization, that incentivize the private sector in order to invest more in these various African countries. And then pillar number 3 is about trade, particularly the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Almost everybody has ratified the agreement now, but how do you move forward with that? How do you reduce the trade barriers? So those are the 3 pillars: accountability, policy, and then trade focus.
All right, those are very pertinent pillars. We have to say accountability will definitely be a firm ground on which to stand on. But on the matter of trade, there was a headline in this day newspaper that refers to ECOWAS and aviation tariffs. How complex will it be for the different African governments to agree on even lower import duties?
Abby, it's complex. I mean, trade agreements take a long time. We talk about the AFCFTA now for how many years now? I mean, they've ratified things, but then moving forward, there's so many agreements. And I'm glad that this day focused on that ECOWAS portion and aviation. We talk about how you travel a lot. We travel a lot at the Arise News Channel. And we talk about how you have to fly to, in the Middle East to fly back into Northern Africa, if you're going from one country to the next, how you have to be going to Europe to come back in. The aviation tariffs are used as revenue drivers for the different countries to either build more airports or maintain the existing aviation structures that they have. I think Bismarck Rewane is in the news today on the cover of today's This Day newspaper, where I think it was talking about how many airports in Nigeria are underutilized. So, maybe he's talking a lot about waste, but by and large, the issue with the aviation tariffs is that they are needed, right? Every single time a flight goes from one African nation to the next, there are taxes associated with that, and those taxes are supposed to go towards development of the respective aviation industries in the respective African countries. So there's going to be some pushback to lowering them because you're cutting revenues. But then the flip side is that what the ECOWAS is saying is that, listen, by lowering these tariffs, you can, you're making it less, to some degree, less expensive. I know there are other taxes, but to some degree, you're making it less expensive to travel, and that should boost trade. Of course, Abby, there's issues with visas and other stuff like that. But the macro view is that, tariffs, everybody's talking about tariffs and trade. They are complex. There's a lot of nitty-gritty that you have to go through. But they are steadfast, the folks at the AFCFTA, in trying to get this done.
Well, it's always great to hear that. And of course, the forum is in full swing, as we all know. What can you tell us about the opening ceremony earlier this morning and the first panels held today?
Yeah, so of course, His Excellency Alassane Ouattara, the President of the Federal Republic of Cote d'Ivoire, was on the opening panel, as was Makta Diop, Managing Director of the International Finance Corporation, which partners with Jeune Afrique to put together this Africa CEO Forum on an annual basis. They talked about, regional integration. And that was the same topic that also happened with the presidential panel. As I mentioned earlier, President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa is here. He was a part of that panel. So was President Kagame of Rwanda. The president of Mauritius, Mohamed El Ghussani, he was also there. Vice President of Cote d'Ivoire, he participated in the presidential panel. So they were all about regional integration, reducing these trade barriers, but by and large, Africa depending on itself. Can it do that? So those are the big topics and the big headline names that were on this morning.
All right, sounds like quite the full house, and of course some very pertinent topics there, so we'll be looking forward to a lot from you. But Rotus, since we're talking about global matters, especially around trade, what should we make of the agreement in Geneva between the US and China?
Yeah, the markets like it. If you look at the S&P, Dow, NASDAQ futures, they're all taken up, particularly the NASDAQ and chip stocks. In Hong Kong, the Hang Seng Tech Index, I think, was up about 5% this morning. So Asian markets generally liked what they heard. So basically, I think you've already touched on it in your headlines. The US and China have agreed to reduce tariffs for 90 days while they still talk. I think the US is going to reduce its tariffs on Chinese items to 30% because the 10% baseline is still there. The extra 20% is on those fentanyl imports coming into America. And then China will reduce America to about 10%. So it looks like trade tensions between the US and China are thawing. These are the two largest economies in the world. The markets like it because they hope it will lead to a trade deal that will be beneficial to all parties. It reduces the temperature in the room, Abby. But of course, the key thing here is details, details, details. The US-UK trade agreement or trade framework that was announced last week, we haven't heard any details on that. And I hear that one started in Trump's first term, which again points to your question on the complexities around trade deals. So it remains to be seen what exactly the details are. Because look, a 30% tariff on Chinese imports into America is still pretty high, right? But this is better than 145%. So it's positive. We just need to wait for more details from the delegations from the US and from China.
All right, details is certainly going to be very important, as you've highlighted. And of course, expectations are quite on the rise there. Well, we'll unfortunately run out of time, but many thanks, Rotus, for the updates. And we'll certainly look out for more from you as the forum progresses. I've been chatting with Rotus Oddiri. You're watching the Global Business Report here on Arise News.